In the studio with me is Noel Doran, editor of the Irish News, and Ed Curran from the Belfast Telegraph. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. Ed Curran, this turnout, less than 43%, that's the story so far, that's all we know for sure. What do you read into that?
Well, I think there's a much bigger issue than simply that people are turned off by European politics. If I could put it another way, this is D-Day weekend, and I think I can think of a number of words beginning with D that actually indicate why things have changed here in Northern Ireland. I mean, there's dismay at the Westminster expenses scandal. I think there's disappointment with the Stormont Assembly to date, and there's general disillusion with politics in general. And this might well be a turning point, I think, for our political system. The new buzzwords I heard this morning from Peter Mandelson, which might be heard over and over again in the next coming days, are democratic renewal. Okay. And a lot of emphasis will be placed on trying to get people back interested in politics.
Well, Noel Doran, it seems from what Sidney Elliott was saying there that you could assume perhaps that turnout was higher amongst the nationalist electorate. Why is that the case?
I think clearly, as Ed says, there is a degree of disillusionment on the unionist side. I think the story of the election is very much Jim Allister and what's happening within unionism. It's a little bit closer to as you were on the nationalist side. I don't think there was a huge turnout anywhere. I think clearly Sinn Féin, as always, have got their vote out. The SDLP seem to be reasonably happy with their performance. The story is very much on the other side. What impact is Jim Allister going to have further down the line? Can he take 5, 6, 7 Assembly seats, possibly depriving the DUP of the overall majority? Can he take 1 or 2 Westminster seats? Westminster seats could even end up as MP for North Antrim.
Well, this is the psychological impact of this on the DUP, Ed Curran, of Sinn Féin topping the poll and of Jim Allister snapping at their heels.
Well, I think the voting in the unionist community was certainly down more than in the nationalist community, and I suspect an element of that was because unionists are confused. There are confusing messages coming out. I think they see, for example, the Democratic Unionists who seem to be buddies with Sinn Féin one day and their enemies the next.
So do you think they fought the wrong sort of campaign in terms of their message about topping the poll?
I think that they were also hit by the Westminster expenses scandal in a way that perhaps some of the other parties weren't, because they have so many MPs at Westminster. And in particular, I think what was damaging was the revelations in relation to the First Minister and his wife, and the amount of salary and the amount of expenses that they were earning from Westminster. These things impacted, I suspect, on ordinary people. And across the board in Northern Ireland, many people feel that I think their politicians have actually moved into almost a different social class than what they are.
But if we're seeing, so it's unionists in particular, though, in a sense, seem to have been turned off. It used to be called Garden Centre unionists. Perhaps with the good weather, they were all at the Garden Centre on Thursday. But what is it that's going to draw them back in? I mean, does Jim Nicholson, interesting to look at his vote, will the Conservative tie-up perhaps benefit him?
Well, I think so long as you have the two different unionist parties and now this third traditional unionist voice, you're going to have confusion within the unionist community. I would argue that, in fact, in the future, they're going to have to revise where they are. They're going to have to look at what their message is, what their vision is. And I'm not saying that they can actually come to some kind of cohesion, but they're going to have to reach a point where it's not simply a them and us between 2 or 3 parties asking unionists every time to come out and vote for them. I think they've got to have a far clearer vision than they currently have. The Democratic Unionists seem to me to be confusing their own supporters by their approach at Stormont.
Noel Doran, do you think that the unionist battle made it easy for the likes of Sinn Féin? Possibly made it a little easier, and it was noticeable that the tone on the nationalist side was much lower key. There were no big exchanges between the two main candidates, none of the aggression that we saw elsewhere, which seems to have had a very negative effect on the unionist side of things generally. Possibly a slightly more relaxed attitude there, although from Sinn Féin's point of view, they clearly haven't done as well in the south as they would have hoped, but it's clearly a very strong performance in the north. I think what they'll be looking to now is what is going to happen over the devolution of policing and justice. Is the executive going to survive, as some people are starting to wonder? Certainly would appear that policing and justice is going to be on the longer finger, and that's not going to suit Sinn Féin in many different ways.
And when you look at the turnout figures and what we're speculating on at the moment, do you think there is a second nationalist seat there at Europe?
it would be a turn-up. I mean, it's not impossible. We saw Alistair MacDonald coming through to win South Belfast in unusual circumstances. In a PR election, the odds are against Alban McGuinness. His colleagues believe that he's polled credibly, but it would take an unusual set of circumstances to allow him to sneak up.
Looking ahead then to a Westminster election, Ed Curran, the DUP and indeed some of the other parties now have pledged to give up the double jobbing. Do you think, though, it might be all bets are off if they're in a situation where they seriously are worried about retaining their seats? I mean, are we going to see a much more flux now at Westminster?
I think we're going to see a revolution. In many of the MPs in Northern Ireland are no longer going to be MPs in the next 2 years. I think if the double jobbing issue is not addressed, and I'm quite certain that the expenses scandal at Westminster will probably be addressed either by Gordon Brown or whoever succeeds him. But in Northern Ireland, there seems to be far too much concentration of politics in the hands of too few people. And this is beginning to register with people. So you're going to have to, within the parties themselves have got to address this, and the Democratic Unionist Party in particular has a big challenge on its hands because so many of them are involved in this double jobbing. But I think they're going to have to address it, otherwise they will be in trouble.
And do you think, though, the electorate are perhaps less hidebound and where they put that X or that preference now when they go into the voting booth? Are we seeing more potential for change?
We are seeing a complete change in the way that people actually look at politicians. The politicians of old who came over from Westminster and perhaps addressed a meeting in an Orange Hall once a month and handed down their tablets of wisdom, or even Republicans who went to Easter Rising commemorations and handed out their tablets of wisdom, that is not going to be enough in future. They've got to have more media savvy, they've got to be closer to the people, they've got to be more open and transparent than they have been in the past. And I think they're also going to have to be more interactive and use, for example, Facebook and Twitter and the internet, etc., in a way that many of these politicians that we have at the moment don't understand.
But, Noel Doran, do you agree that perhaps the political class is still fighting old battles that a large section of the electorate seems to be disinterested in these days?
Well, things have clearly moved on, certainly since the heady days of the Good Friday Agreement and the ceasefires of the 1990s. We're in a very different set of circumstances here. But I still think there's a lot of uncertainty about, and this election's indicated there's a lot of confusion out there. And I think over the next few days, people are going to be looking very closely at these results. It's a little unfair to pay too much attention to a European election. It's essentially a mid-term referendum. It doesn't have the same weight as a Westminster or an Assembly election.
Do you think it was a free kick, perhaps, for disaffected unionists to vote, perhaps, for Jim Allister?
It clearly was, because with respect to Diane Dodds, she didn't really have the experience or the stature to carry this one off. She was by no means the first choice on the DUP side, so it's therefore not entirely a fair contest. But it's telling that they couldn't get anyone else to come through, and it looks as though Jim Allister's going to run very close with Diane Dodds.
OK, gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed.